7 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Chris and Karen McDonough from the interview room brought several details back into focus on their most recent show, and I believe that some of them deserve a much closer look. They have been reaching out to people who knew Nancy, her friends, her acquaintances, people connected to her church, even someone involved in organizing an early candlelight vigil. And according to Karen, they're encountering the same response over and over. People simply don't want to talk. Not about the investigation. They don't even want to talk about Nancy, their friend, their neighbor. And when an 84-year-old woman is still missing after nearly 7 months, and the people who knew her don't even...
7 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Chris and Karen from the interview room brought some details back into focus that deserve closer scrutiny. They've been reaching out to people who knew Nancy, friends, acquaintances, church contacts, even someone who helped organize an early candlelight vigil. And according to Karen, the response is consistent. People don't want to talk. Not about the investigation, not even about Nancy herself. When an 84-year-old woman is still missing after nearly 7 months, and the people who knew her won't publicly describe who she was, that's a pattern worth examining. My name is Charles Brewer. I've spent 21 years in law enforcement, and today we're looking at several points Chris and Karen raised, some documented, some observational, some purely theoretical. I'll try to keep those categories separate, because asking whether something deserves another look is different from claiming we already know the answer. There's a real difference between suspicion and proof. But silence can become relevant once it forms a recognizable pattern. And that's what we're seeing here.
Become a part of the Brew Crew. Now let's get into this. Now, I believe that this was probably Karen's strongest point throughout the entire 2-hour show. She and Chris said that they have reached out to people connected to Nancy, not asking questions about the investigation. Instead, Karen says that they've tried asking people to just describe Nancy. They wanted to know about Nancy. They wanted to know her personality, her routines, what she enjoyed, what kind of friend was Nancy, what her life looked like before her daughter became nationally known. And according to Karen, even those communications have been difficult to get. One woman who helped organize an early candlelight vigil reportedly declined Karen's request to just talk months later. Karen said that the response was essentially that, out of respect for Savannah and her siblings, she would decline comment. What does that even mean? Karen herself, she makes an important distinction that, silence doesn't imply guilt. And I agree completely. But listen, silence can still become relevant when it develops into a recognizable pattern.
Karen's strongest point. They reached out to people connected to Nancy not to discuss the investigation, but simply to ask who she was, her personality, her routines, her life before her daughter became nationally known. Even those requests were difficult. One woman who helped organize the vigil declined to comment, citing respect for Savannah and her siblings. What does it mean for an elderly woman's friend to refuse to talk about her out of respect for her children? Respect for the living has somehow eclipsed the memory of the missing.
Now, here's what interests me from an investigative standpoint. When someone disappears, investigators, they don't just investigate the crime. Believe it or not, they investigate the victim because, the victim's life establishes context. Investigators, they want to know who knew her, who spoke to her, who visited her, who knew her routine, who knew when she would be home or when she would be alone, who knew where she lived, and who knew the layout of her home. What about the cameras? Who knew about the cameras? Those details build what investigators sometimes refer to as victimology. And in this case, victimology could be extremely important. Karen made another point that I believe deserves some more attention because, friends, they know things that investigators initially don't. They know Nancy's routines. They know the church schedules, the social gatherings. They know her appointments. People that Nancy trusted, people that she disliked, changes in her behavior and just in conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but became important afterwards. Karen specifically discussed the importance of identifying the last person who had a meaningful conversation with Nancy. And that's not necessarily the last person who physically saw her or spoke to her. She's talking about a meaningful conversation, an intimate conversation where you talk about details that you wouldn't talk about in front of your children. Personal things, your feelings. And that distinction matters because Nancy could have mentioned something during an ordinary conversation that didn't seem important at the time. Maybe someone stopping by, someone calling. Something might have been worrying her. Something that, she may have been planning. A new acquaintance or a repair person, a delivery, maybe a financial matter, just really anything. Chris and Karen, they aren't establishing that any of those things occurred. They're just pointing out why knowing Nancy as a person still matters.
Here's why that matters. Investigators don't just investigate the crime, they investigate the victim. Her life establishes context. Who knew her routine? Who knew when she'd be alone? Who knew her home's layout and cameras? That's victimology, and in this case, it could be critical. Friends know things investigators don't yet. Church schedules, social gatherings, people Nancy trusted or disliked, behavioral changes, conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but might matter now. Karen emphasized identifying the last person who had a meaningful conversation with Nancy. Not just the last person who saw or spoke to her, but someone she confided in. Somewhere in those forgotten conversations may be the key to everything. We know someone appeared at Nancy's property overnight, concealed his appearance, and seemed prepared.
Now, we know an individual appeared at Nancy's property during that overnight period. He concealed his appearance, and he appeared somewhat prepared. He was there in the middle of the night. Those circumstances support a legitimate investigative question about prior knowledge. They don't prove the offender personally knew Nancy. There are many other ways that someone can learn a victim's schedule. Someone could have surveilled Nancy for days, months, and even years. Someone could have trolled her social media accounts, gotten information from another person, or had prior legitimate contact with Nancy, such as a service call to Nancy's residence. Maybe a delivery or a contractor. Any number of possibilities. But something allowed this offender to arrive at Nancy's home at a very particular time.
That raises a legitimate question about prior knowledge, though it doesn't prove the offender personally knew her. He could have surveilled her for months, gathered information from her social media or from another person, or had prior legitimate contact through a delivery or service call. Whatever the source, something let him arrive at a very particular time. That's why investigators are likely more interested in how he knew what he knew than in who Porch Guy is. He didn't materialize from the desert. He came from somewhere, learned something, traveled there. That's the investigative trail. 7 months in, we may be spending too much energy on what he did after arriving and not enough on what had to happen before. Chris raised an interesting point about the back of Nancy's house.
Now, Chris, he then moved into an area that I think is genuinely interesting, and that's Nancy's house. the back of Nancy's house. According to his analysis of photographs, there were 2 different doors accessible from the rear porch area. Chris questioned why an offender would choose a door that apparently needed to be propped open when another door might have been simpler. He also questioned the broader narrative that Nancy routinely left doors unsecured when photographs appeared to show multiple locks, cameras, and security measures. Those are his observations. Now, this is where photographs can be helpful and dangerous at the same time. You know, a photograph tells us what existed. Someone could have 6 locks and still forget to lock a door. I've done that. Many of us have. Someone can own security cameras and leave a door unlocked during the daytime. Someone could have an elaborate security system and occasionally become complacent. And I'm sure that we've all done that. The photograph, you know, it doesn't prove that Nancy's back doors were locked or unlocked. What it does establish is something investigators would absolutely document, and that's that the physical security configuration of that house, the entire house. Which doors locked, how they locked, and which doors were open and which were closed, and whether the scene was consistent with the account that investigators initially received. That's proper scene reconstruction.
2 doors were accessible from the rear porch, and he questioned why an offender would choose one that needed propping open when another might have been simpler. He also challenged the narrative that Nancy routinely left doors unsecured, given photos showing multiple locks and cameras. Photographs are useful and risky at once. They show what existed, not what was actually locked that night. Someone can own 6 locks and still forget one. What the photos do establish is the physical security configuration investigators would document. Which doors locked, which were open, whether the scene matched the account initially given. That's scene reconstruction, nothing more. Chris also challenged the idea that family members initially believed Nancy was having a medical emergency when they found a door open. If that were true, investigators should check whether she attempted to call 911. A reasonable check, though its absence wouldn't disprove a medical event. More important is the 911 call made when Nancy was found missing, which could establish the earliest documented account. What door was used, what families saw, when concern shifted from medical emergency to missing to crime scene. Chris also asked about garage activity the following morning, not just the night before. Was it opened electronically, creating another timestamp? He's not claiming that data exists, just asking why public discussion has focused on one night and not the search the next day. This matters because digital timestamps, garage systems, doorbells, smart locks, phones, vehicle telematics, wearables, are reliable timeline anchors that complement imperfect memory. Another major point, a vehicle from another residence was impounded for roughly 40 days.
This is another issue that Chris and Karen emphasized heavily. A vehicle associated with another residence was impounded and reportedly held for roughly 40 days. We've discussed that vehicle on this channel last week and probably prior to that. Chris points to the length of retention and asks what investigators were examining. Were they examining vehicle telematics? Maybe the navigation information? Perhaps DNA, trace evidence, digital devices, or something else? We don't know what investigators actually found. Chris interprets the level of investigative attention as meaningful. Holding and examining a vehicle for that length of time tells me that investigators believe that there was some legitimate investigative reason to retain it. And this is where I've been consistent. You don't dismantle portions of a vehicle, examine electronic systems, hold that vehicle for an extended period of time, and then reassemble it because investigators are just simply bored. There was an investigative purpose. Maybe the examination produced something important. Maybe it eliminated something. Both outcomes have investigative value. And until the warrant, the return, the inventory, and forensic report or some other documentation becomes public, there will be a lot of speculation surrounding the impoundment of this vehicle. There already is.
Chris asks what investigators were examining: telematics, navigation data, DNA, digital devices, something else. We don't know the results, but that length of retention suggests a real investigative reason. You don't disassemble and hold a vehicle that long, then reassemble it, without purpose. Whether the outcome eliminated or confirmed something, both have investigative value. But until documentation becomes public, speculation will continue. Chris also focused on photos showing investigators at that other residence, identifying what he believed was Cellebrite equipment and possibly ICAC personnel. His interpretation, not confirmed. Still, the broader point stands. Specialized resources appearing somewhere usually means detectives have a reason. The question is what mission they were performing: data preservation, phone extraction, computer analysis, and we simply don't know. Then there's the photo showing investigators near the backyard/pool walkway, whose body language Chris interpreted as possibly examining blood.
Now we get back to what I believe could become the most talked about part of Chris and Karen's video. Chris showed an image from behind Nancy's residence. Several investigators appear to be standing near an area around the backyard or the pool walkway. Chris believes that their body positioning and attention may suggest that they are discussing or examining something. And then he raises the possibility, could investigators have been looking at blood? That is where we have to stop. You know, the photograph doesn't prove that. Chris did not establish that testing confirmed blood was there. He's just asking whether that's what investigators could have been examining. Now, I'm going to tell you what I see. I see investigators gathered around an area. Something has their attention, and that's fair. But body language doesn't tell me what they're looking at. It could be biological evidence. It could be a footprint. It could be an object. Or it could be just someone simply explaining the layout of the scene. We don't know. And as Chris and Karen stated in their show, federal investigators recently returned to an area behind Nancy's house. And that makes the location even more interesting, but it still doesn't prove anything one way or another.
That's where we have to stop. The photo doesn't confirm anything. It could be biological evidence, a footprint, an object, or simply someone explaining the scene layout. Federal investigators reportedly returned to that area recently, which makes it more interesting but still proves nothing on its own. The most speculative part of their discussion involves a controlled narrative. Chris wondering whether people are being discouraged from speaking, referencing lawyers, PR involvement, family influence, and talking points for Sheriff Nanos.
Now we need to address the most speculative portion of the interview room's discussion. Chris repeatedly describes what he sees as a controlled narrative. He wonders whether people are being encouraged not to speak. He raises possibilities involving lawyers, public relations professionals, family influence, talking points given to Sheriff Nanos. And Karen references at least one person declining an interview out of respect for Savannah and her siblings. Now, Chris and Karen, they are asking whether these things are connected, but we don't know. Here's where Chris and Karen have a point, though. 7 months later, Nancy herself shouldn't disappear from the conversation, because the more the public knows about Nancy as a person, the greater the possibility that something triggers somebody's memory. And that's where I give a lot of credit to these content creators who have stormed the streets of Tucson and the Catalina foothills from day one, keeping Nancy's picture, keeping her name in the public. Because we don't want this case going silent. We may not be hearing what's going on behind the scene right now. We may not be having evidence and press conferences every day or every week or even once a month. But we need to keep Nancy's name in the public. We don't want to forget Nancy.
Karen notes at least one person declining comment out of respect for Savannah and her siblings. We don't know if these things are connected, but there's a fair point buried in it. 7 months later, Nancy herself shouldn't disappear from the conversation. The more the public knows about her as a person, the greater the chance something jogs someone's memory. That's why creators who've kept her picture and name circulating deserve credit. We don't want this case to go quiet. This part actually bothers me. Somewhere along the way, Nancy Guthrie became secondary to the story about Nancy Guthrie. The conversation became Sheriff Nanos, the FBI, ransom notes, Savannah, porch guy, cameras, content creators, and Nancy became the person in the middle whose own life we know surprisingly little about. Karen asked something close to this herself. Has Nancy become a character in Savannah's story rather than the central figure in her own? If I were approaching this case today, I'd go back to Nancy, her complete victimology.
If I were approaching this case from an investigative standpoint today, 7 months later, I would go back to Nancy, her complete victimology. Every regular visitor, every service provider, every contractor, and every delivery, every standing appointment, every person who knew her weekend routine, every person who knew her house and her security system, who knew that she lived alone, every person who could reasonably predict when she would return home. And then I'd compare that universe of people against what investigators already possess, like the DNA, the phones, the vehicles, camera images, digital records and financial evidence, search warrant returns, and whatever other evidence the public has never even seen. Because Porch Guy didn't materialize out of the Arizona desert at 2 a.m. in the morning. He came from somewhere. He learned something somewhere. He traveled there somehow. He left there somehow. And that's the investigative trail. And here's the point that I don't want lost. 7 months later, we may be spending too much time studying what Porch Guy did after he arrived, and not enough time examining what had to happen before he arrived. He had to select that house. He had to get there. He had to know or believe that the circumstances were right. That preparation may ultimately tell investigators more than the footage ever will. And that's where I believe that the deeper investigation lives.
Every regular visitor, service provider, contractor, delivery person, anyone who knew her routine, her home, her security system, that she lived alone, and when she'd be back. Then compare that universe of people against what investigators already have: DNA, phones, vehicles, camera footage, digital and financial records, warrant returns, everything the public hasn't seen. Because Porch Guy didn't materialize from the desert at 2 a.m. He came from somewhere, learned something, traveled there, and left somehow. That's the trail. Chris and Karen raised legitimate questions alongside theories that remain theories.
Chris and Karen raised some very legitimate questions. They also raised some theories that remain theories. The backyard photograph is interesting. it doesn't establish blood. The investigators at another residence are interesting. Their presence doesn't establish what they found. The vehicle that was held for approximately 40 days is significant investigative activity, but it doesn't establish incriminating evidence. People declining interviews is unusual enough to discuss, but it doesn't establish a coordinated effort to silence anyone. It is highly suspicious, but it's not evidence. And the doors, they deserve examination. But photographs alone don't establish Nancy's actual locking habits. That's how I'm separating this. Observation, evidence, inference, and speculation. Those four things should never be treated as interchangeable. And I think there's another responsibility that we have. If someone knew Nancy personally and chooses not to speak publicly, that's their right. They don't owe YouTube an interview. But if somebody knows something, anything, that could genuinely help investigators understand Nancy's routines and her relationships or her final days, that information belongs with law enforcement. Even something that seemed insignificant 7 months ago might look completely different today. That's how cases sometimes break.
The backyard photo is interesting but doesn't establish blood. The presence of investigators at another residence is notable but doesn't establish what they found. The 40-day vehicle hold is significant activity but not proof of anything incriminating. People declining interviews is unusual but not evidence of coordinated silence. The doors deserve scrutiny, but photos alone don't establish Nancy's actual habits. Observation, evidence, inference, and speculation are four different things and should never be treated as interchangeable. If someone knew Nancy and chooses not to speak publicly, that's their right. They don't owe YouTube an interview. But if anyone knows anything that could help investigators understand her routines, relationships, or final days, that information belongs with law enforcement. Something that seemed insignificant 7 months ago might look very different today. That's often how cases break. To whoever is responsible, 7 months hasn't erased what happened that night.
And to the person responsible for taking Nancy Guthrie, 7 months has not erased what happened that night. The cameras still exist. The DNA still exists. The digital records still exist. And the vehicle still exists in the physical world. People remember. Devices remember even better. And somewhere in everything that investigators have collected may be one small inconsistency that eventually connects you to that house. And you may know something the public doesn't. But listen, investigators, they may know something about you that you don't know that they know. Think about that.
The cameras, the DNA, the digital records, the vehicles, all still exist. People remember, and devices remember even better. Somewhere in everything investigators have collected may be one inconsistency that eventually connects you to that house. If you know where Nancy is, tell investigators. Bring her home. I don't believe every unanswered question points towards something sinister. But unanswered questions are exactly where careful analysis belongs, and keeping Nancy's story visible matters.
I don't agree that every unanswered question necessarily points toward something suspicious. But unanswered questions are exactly where careful analysis belongs. And keeping Nancy's story in front of the public, it matters. I also want to thank every member of the Brew Crew, especially my channel members who help support these deeper investigative videos. Your support genuinely helps. It helps me continue doing this. And remember, we don't need to manufacture a suspect. We need to keep looking at the evidence until the evidence identifies one. Stay safe out there and stay aware. Keep Nancy Guthrie in your thoughts. Don't forget Nancy Guthrie.
We don't need to manufacture a suspect. We need to keep looking at the evidence until it identifies one. So here's my question. 7 months later, why has an 84-year-old woman's life become something people won't discuss, out of respect for her children? When did that become the priority? And what does that tell you about everything else they're not saying? Stay safe, stay aware, and don't forget Nancy Guthrie.